Well, good afternoon, everybody. It looks like we've got a lot of people that have joined us here already. I'm sure we'll have some more filter into this lunch and learn that we have going for us in the next few minutes as well. But I did want to go ahead and get us started. It's just a little bit afternoon here. Hello again and welcome. My name is Taylor Bucksbaum. I'm a Director of Development at Arkansas State University. We are really excited to kick off this Lunch and Learn series. This is our inaugural Lunch and Learn event hosted by the A-State Alumni Association. And we're really happy to be able to kick off this series with our guest today, Dr. Shane Speights, Dean of the New York Institute of Technology, College of Osteopathic Medicine at Arkansas State University. As a lot of you saw as you were registering, we did ask for questions to be submitted during that part of the process. But if you have any questions that pop up during the presentation, please put them into the chat. We'll keep an eye on those as we're going through, and we will address those questions as time permits at the end of the presentation. So a little bit more about Dr. Speights. I apologize, give me just one second. All right, so Dr. Speights, again, Dean of the NYIT College of Osteopathic Medicine at Arkansas State University. Dr. Speights has been in his current role as the Dean since 2017 and has been on faculty with the college since its inception. He is board certified in family medicine, and in addition to his role as Dean, he also serves as the medical director of the city of Jonesboro and is the assistant health officer for Craighead County. He's a native of Arkadelphia. Dr. Speights earned a degree in business administration from Henderson State University before completing his requirements for medical school here at Arkansas State University. He received his medical degree from Kansas City College of Osteopathic Medicine and completed his residency training at University of Arkansas for Medical Science Northeast Family Medicine Residency at St. Bernard's Medical Center in Jonesboro. As Dean of NYITCom at A-State, Dr. Speights leads faculty and students in academic and co-curricular activities while engaging in community outreach with hospitals and physicians in Jonesboro and the Greater Delta region. Previously, Dr. Speights served as Associate Dean of Clinical Education for the college. Speights is a frequent lecturer and has made several media appearances speaking on topics that include health trends, media education, and healthcare technology. Dr. Speights and his wife Cheryl live here in Jonesboro with their 4 children. And if I may, Dr. Speights, your wife is an Arkansas State grad as well and actually a Wilson Award winner. Is that correct?
Absolutely. I certainly married up, so make no mistake at all that, yeah, she is by far the more successful of the family.
Well, we're definitely very happy to have you here today. Thank you so much for taking some time to speak with us and telling the story of the College of Osteopathic Medicine here. We've been so grateful to have you guys in Jonesboro.
Absolutely, Taylor. Thank you so much for the opportunity. We appreciate the time. This is actually, it's interesting. I've been talking about COVID for so many months. It's an exciting time to talk about the campus in general and what we've been doing here for the last 4 to 5 years and really even before then. So I'm happy to give you guys a kind of an update on kind of where we came and kind of where we are now and where we're going. So I'll go ahead and get started if that's okay, Taylor.
Please do. Take it away.
All right. Thank you, sir. Let me go ahead and share my screen with you. And we'll go through some slides, and hopefully this will be some information, some data that many of you have not seen. Some of you may have been aware of the backstory in terms of how we got here, and that's kind of what I'm going to go over with you today. But there certainly will be time, as Taylor mentioned, for questions regarding COVID, because I know that's also on everyone's minds. So just a brief history, really. This conversation started back in 2012. At that time, I was actually employed by my local hospital, St. Bernard's Medical Hospital or Medical Center, and I was the Vice President of Medical Affairs there. And I was involved in the discussion as a local osteopathic physician in terms of how ASU could bring an osteopathic medical school to the campus here in Jonesboro. And ASU, many of you remember Jason Penry, Dr. Jason Penry, who's now at Texas A&M. He and I worked very closely together in terms of this endeavor and trying to basically drum up business, so to speak, and support throughout the state and throughout the region for this. lots of trips on the road, so to speak, that he and I could certainly swap stories about. But it was a great time. It was a lot of learning went on for sure about how do you start an osteopathic medical school. But the decision to bring NYIT on, that happened about 2012 or so. And for those of you that don't know, NYIT itself, the main campus there in New York is on Long Island. They have about 300 students, 325 students per class. We have 115 students per class. They're much larger. They've been in existence for over 40 years. That school has been their very successful school. They primarily produce graduates that populate the greater New York area. So we opened our doors to the first class in 2016 in the newly renovated Wilson Hall. Now, many of you may have actually had classes in Wilson Hall. I want to go ahead and extend the invitation right now. If you've not visited Wilson Hall, we encourage you to come visit us. I think you'd be amazed at what we've done. I think for those of you that have seen the building, you would agree with that. It's got some of the latest technology in this region or in this part of the state for sure. It was a $12 million renovation that really occurred just in a matter of 10 to 11 months. It was amazing how quickly they were able to do that renovation. So get with Casey or email him directly or get with him on Facebook, and we'd love to show the building off to those of you that are familiar with Wilson Hall, like my wife was, who had many classes in Wilson Hall. The program itself, just so that because some people get this confused, I'm an employee of NYIT. Casey is as well, and so we're employed by the main campus in New York. The degree is conferred by NYIT. It's a New York Institute of Technology degree. We lease Wilson Hall, so we basically rent Wilson Hall, but we're over the curriculum. We pretty much pay for everything from outside or from inside the wall, so to speak. So from the plug-in, computers, desks, things like that, that all falls to NYIT. Like I said, again, we do pay student fees as well to ASU, and what that means is that our students kind of have what we call dual citizenship. So it means that basically they can access the ASU library, they can use the cafeteria, they can get into the dining plan, they can even stay on campus and they're at the Circle apartments. Many of our students stay in the Circle apartments, and I think that also helps ASU from a revenue part. So we're happy to be a good partner with them on that. This is a 4-year medical school, so we don't just do part of it. We do all 4 years of medical school out of this campus location here. The first 2 years are spent inside the building, which is what we call preclinical, and the 3rd and 4th years are outside the building, which is when they're in the doctor's offices, they're in the hospitals, the urgent cares, the ERs, and that's how they complete their training there. So they do not do any training in New York or anything like that. Again, we're accredited for 115 students. What happens after you graduate medical school? Well, this may be new to some of you. You can't practice medicine once you graduate medical school. So once you finish 4 years of medical school, what your choice is then is to go on and do additional training in a specialty. And so that's a minimum of 3 more years in either something like family medicine or pediatrics, internal medicine, general surgery, neurology, ER, orthopedics. That's when you go out and you get these specialty training. You can't practice medicine without that additional training now. And so they spend their 4 years here on our campus. When they graduate, they go into something called the match, which is where they match into the specialty that they want to go into. We're so happy. We went through our first match, which happened last March, even though it was virtual, it happened last March. And we had 99% of our students, really all but one student, actually went into the program that they wanted to. So just really excited. That's a great number. When you look at the national average, it's about 90%. So only about 90% of medical students from a specific medical school will be able to go into a program and go on to that additional training. So we're very happy about that, and we hope to continue that trend. Our students matched into very competitive programs: dermatology, ophthalmology, psychiatry, emergency medicine, orthopedics, I mean, you name it. Now, a good number of our students actually went into what we call the primary specialties, and I'll talk about that in a second. Unfortunately, like everything, we had to do it virtually. So just a little differences. This has actually come up in the national media as well, so I thought I'd spend a second talking about the difference between MD and DO. The reality is that the coursework or the curriculum is pretty much identical. I mean, everybody has to go to gross anatomy. Everybody has to learn the biochemistry, the immunology. Everybody has to understand how coronavirus works. Everybody has to understand pharmacology. You have to write prescriptions and learn how to perform surgeries and all of that. And everybody has to do the same kind of rotations. Everybody, whether you're an MD or DO student, you got to rotate in family medicine and surgery and psychiatry and the like. The additional piece is the osteopathic manipulative medicine, which is what we have highlighted there in the bottom. And it's an additional about 200 hours of training, of hands-on manipulative training, where you learn to diagnose and treat really with your hands. And it's really common things: headaches, backaches, upper extremity pains, injuries, things of that nature. You really learn how to palpate the musculature and the skeletal structure, identify restrictions, and then remove those. And so that's we say an extra tool in the tool belt. Now, that comes from the general foundation of osteopathic medicine. And what I mean by that is, we believe in osteopathic medicine that the body inherently has the ability to heal itself if just given the chance. So we believe that the body is an amazing machine that really can do its job better than any of us can. So how can we help the body be successful? And so you'll hear more from our physicians about diet and exercise and about ways to stay healthy. You'll hear us talk about something like the lymphatic system. You may not hear much about that on the MD side. We make a big deal about the lymphatic system. And all that dovetails into the manipulative medicine that our students learn in our physicians' practice. DOs, or doctors of osteopathic medicine, are more likely to practice in rural areas. So typically you're going to find that's kind of how the profession was set up basically in the late 1800s, was the need for rural physicians really out west. And that's kind of how it was born. And MD is actually the physician who created osteopathic medicine. And though DOs can practice in any specialty, the vast majority of them go into family medicine, pediatrics, or general internal medicine, really those frontline areas of need. Our students that graduated back in May, that proved to be the same for us. We had over 70% of them go into primary care. 35% went straight into family medicine, which is a high number really for any medical school. And really those are the biggest areas of need, not only in our state, but in this region of the country. The Delta region, whether you know it or not, is actually one of the most poorest, most underserved areas in the entire country. And there's a significant shortage in terms of physician providers. And so the health outcomes are really dramatic when you start to pull those up and look at them graphically compared to other areas of even just the state of Arkansas. We overall rank low, the state of Arkansas does, in terms of our health outcomes. And you can see there, that's from America's Health Rankings. These are websites you can pull up yourself. And then in terms of active physicians, we rank low. So in terms of the number of physicians per capita, we need more doctors. And so that was really the driving force behind why Arkansas State University wanted to bring a medical school specifically here to this region of the state to be able to train more doctors who could stay here and practice medicine in the needed areas for the communities in need. At the end of the day, our mission and vision is that we train excellent physicians. And we train excellent physicians that practice excellent medicine. We also consider that the floor. We mean that's the baseline. We expect everybody to do that. I think every medical school would expect that. We do ask more of our students, and we ask more in terms of what we call servant leadership. We ask them to be a part of their community. We expect them to give back to their community. So we start training them with that mindset while they're in medical school, in terms of the outreach programs that we ask them to be a part of, in terms of the programs that we actually, for lack of a better term, indoctrinate them into so that they can appreciate that. They may not all come with that servant leadership heart, but we try to make sure that they learn it and they get it from us while we're here. The outreach programs that we use, you see that, as I've said here, they're educationally based to make a positive impact on the health outcomes of the state of Arkansas and the Delta region. Sorry, went too fast. Who are we as an entity? We've got over 90 employees. We have 460 students plus. We do go up. We're accredited for 115 students, but we can take up to 124. So some of our classes vary in size. We have no shortage of applicants. We get several thousand applicants, and actually our applicant numbers are up 15% this year, likely due to COVID, and sometimes that's a conversation. Whenever the economy sees a downturn, medical school admissions and applications go up. And so we're seeing a lot of that now. So for our 115, 120 spots, we're seeing several thousand applications from all over the country. On average, we get about 40 students per year from Arkansas. We're happy about that. We'd like for that number to go up. But we get over 90% of our students from targeted Delta states, which includes Louisiana, Mississippi, Tennessee, Illinois, Missouri, and that area. And again, that's our target area. We know that statistically, if a student goes to medical school and residency in the same state or the same region, they are far more likely to stay there and practice medicine. So there's good data to support that theory. In our first 4 classes, we've had over 46 ASU alumni. Again, we're proud of that. I'd like to see that number go up. And 15 of our 2020 class were ASU alumni. Arkansas State University is certainly our biggest feeder school. In terms of our pipeline programs, we think this is vital. We think that you have to cultivate starting at a young age in K-12 as well as into undergrad to be able to get individuals who can come into medical school and have them prepared for that. But in terms of our pipeline programs, it's also based on just education. We don't think everybody can go to medical school. We don't think everybody needs to go to medical school. We do believe that everybody can learn, and we do believe that everyone can understand the importance of a vaccine, the importance of germ theory, the washing your hands. A lot of these things that we would consider basic health there, the importance of a proper diet. Why do you exercise? What's the big deal about that? We can explain that from a physiologic standpoint to an 11th grader. And so we feel like that's our responsibility. We have that information. We have the faculty and the staff that can spread that word. And so why not utilize them, not just to train excellent physicians, but to make a positive impact on the K-12 and undergraduate system here in the state. Project HEART is something that's no pun intended, near and dear to my heart. We're excited about that. That's something we started our very first year we were here, very first outreach project. And specifically, that program looks at individuals who may not have an opportunity to come to a college campus otherwise. These are smart kids. These are kids that do well in school. These are your rising juniors or seniors. And typically, we work with the counselors in the school systems to identify them and say, look, you've got somebody there that, maybe being raised by a single parent, maybe he's having a tough time, maybe it's a foster kid, but they're one of those kids that, if just given the opportunity, could go on and go to college and be something great. Whether they're a physician or not, they could go on to that next level. And so we use Project HEART as that educational tool, and we've gotten students from all over the state and all over the region, and that program continues to grow. It started with, I think, 15 to 20. We're up to 80 or 90 students now. That's something we actually do typically non-COVID in the summertime. We actually bring them to campus. We pay for the whole thing. And so with some donors, we actually have some donors that have been very gracious to be able to give money toward this, but we bring them on campus. And so once they get here, we pay for all housing, all food. They stay here. It's almost a camp-like atmosphere. Our medical students are the camp counselors, so they'll stay with them in the dormitories. It's just a great experience. And so we continue to push that program and hope to expand it even further. Structure Function Technology is a program that we use to teach high school students, and we bring them actually into our gross anatomy lab, and we talk to them about human structure and function, really some of the core pieces of osteopathic medicine. And of course, our students themselves go out into the communities, and they work with local school districts and try to provide good health education. Specifically, this program under the students of osteopathic medicine, 5th and 6th graders are targeted in that program. And regularly, we bring in students into the medical school to do some education as well. In terms of the pandemic, obviously, this was an opportunity for us. I don't know that anybody was prepared for it at all. And so we certainly tried to get our feet under us to be able to provide as much good information as we could. We're so blessed to be able to have specialists. You see Dr. Abraham here on the right-hand side. He is our faculty board certified in infectious disease. We have our dean of research who actually has done research on the SARS virus, the earlier SARS virus. It's just been a wealth of information. We've got experts in public health. And so really, we've got a whole cadre of individuals who can provide great information to the community and to community organizations around the region. And we tried to leverage that throughout this pandemic. We're hopeful that it's been helpful. We feel like that it has, certainly in what we've done with the A-State system and the contact tracing and the case investigation. I feel that's been beneficial. We continue to collect data on that and look forward to seeing what that looks like behind the scenes. Media relations, Casey Pierce, I can't say enough good things about him. Again, talk about hitting the ground running. And then now all of a sudden we're in a global pandemic, but being able to get our microbiologists and our immunologists and getting them, into some of these newspapers so they can get editorials in and things like that. So again, we can get good information out there. I know that's a heavy lift in and of itself. Dr. Dosha Cummins, our chair of basic sciences, she heads up a group that actually creates a newsletter to educate physicians actually out in the field and in the community. And this is where we take good evidence-based medicine, because it's hard. I remember doing this. I was a hospitalist for quite a while, where you'd work 12-hour shifts. To be honest with you, the last thing I want to do when I got home after 12, 13 hours was to sit down and read a bunch of medical articles. I just wanted to eat and go to bed, or see my wife and kids. And so this is an opportunity for us to be able to put out kind of concise, important information and give them the additional articles that they need, but really concise, paragraph form style of information, so that they can quickly see medications, testing, vaccine, signs and symptoms. What's new in terms of treatment? And so Dr. Cummins and her group have been doing that. I couldn't be prouder of that. And of course, you see what we're doing within the Delta Population Health Institute. ASU, the ASU system, the A-State system is 7 institutions. And so we have been providing support in contact tracing and case investigation since August for all 7 institutions, with, of course, here on the Jonesboro campus being the flagship. We've entered into a partnership with the Arkansas Department of Health and the Minority Health Commission to be able to go out and do testing. We've done one round of testing now with our Delta Caravan that's gone out and tested over 330 individuals in underserved and rural areas of the Delta that otherwise couldn't get that testing. We actually piggyback that on food bank deliveries. And we've got more plans coming out to be able to do more testing here in the coming weeks. And we're also part of the Arkansas Department of Health COVID Vaccine Task Force, and meet with them and are working with them in terms of vaccine rollout and how we can be a good community partner on that piece. With that, that was the last slide. And so I'll go ahead and stop sharing my screen. Happy to answer any questions you guys have, or we can shift the conversation over to COVID. Just how I guess I'll kick it back to you, Taylor.
That sounds good. Well, and thank you for all of that, Dr. Speights. That was really, I certainly loved hearing about that and feel like I learned a lot. I'm not seeing any new questions in the chat here. So I think we will go ahead and shift over to some of the COVID-related questions that we received ahead of time. But again, I'll reiterate to those of you in the audience, please, if you have any questions that you'd like to ask Dr. Speights, go ahead and put them in the chat, and we will get to those. So again, first off, again, a lot of these COVID related, first off is actually quite apropos considering that the CDC just today changed this, but we had a question about the quarantine period potentially changing to a shorter time frame with certain parameters around that. And now that it has actually been changed, could you give your thoughts on that and just what you feel as Northeast Arkansans, what would be the best thing for us to be able to do to make sure that we're keeping ourselves and those of us around us safe?
Absolutely. So the first thing I want to say is that, and this has been something I think that we've struggled with in our, we being the medical community have struggled with in our conversation with the public. We're used to change, and we're used to, what I mean by that is the data comes out and says this, then we do this. Now the data comes out and says, no, we were actually wrong there, we got to do this. Okay, now we got to shift and do this. And now, not that there's not debate about the data, there's always that. We have journal clubs. We actually have that. That's something we have here in the medical school. We debate the evidence, debate the information and the quality of data. And so this is not surprising that you'll see things like this come out specifically from the CDC, and it should. You don't want them to hold on to information or data that they were using back in March when new data is available. So it's not real surprising. Remember when the quarantine period came out, the 14 days, basically we knew at that time the data we had was somebody could either show up with symptoms and get sick by about day 2 or by day 14. As the pandemic has progressed, we get more data in terms of, okay, we know it's between 2 days and 14 days. What's the average? Or when do most people get sick? When do somebody's been in contact, when is the most likely time they'll get it? Well, it's between 3 to 5, 3 to 7 days. It's really when the most people, if you're going to get sick from somebody you were exposed to, that's when you're going to start having symptoms. And so we've got enough data now to say, you know what? You're probably safe 7 to 10 days. Now, does that mean you're going to catch everybody? No, it doesn't. As a matter of fact, you will still have people that show up positive or start having symptoms on day 12. But the vast majority of people will show up within that 5 to 7 day window, or that period that I just discussed. Now, I know you mentioned, and we've been watching for the CDC guidelines to come out to change on this. I'll be honest with you, and I just refreshed it when I was here. The CDC hadn't updated their website. So those actual guidelines I have not seen. I've seen every news outlet report it, but I have yet to see the news outlets that actually say, here's the link to the CDC website on the new guidelines. The reason why I say that is because when they put those out, they'll reference everything. They'll put all the different, look, this was the article we're quoting on this, the article we're doing on this. And as a physician and a scientist, that's what I want to see. I want to be able to go dig in and say, okay, where'd you come up with this number? Now, what is the impact? Well, I mean, obviously the impact is going to be great. My wife doesn't have to sit home with the kids for 14 days now. It only has to be 7 days or 10 days. So from an economic impact and from being able to go back to work, I think that's huge. I think they wanted to make sure that the data was there to be able to support that. I do want to be clear. It's not that people can't get sick at day 12, day 13 or so. That still can happen. It's just that the vast majority of individuals that come in contact with somebody, they would show those symptoms within 5 to 7 days. So I hope that's clear. I hope that helps.
Absolutely, and that makes perfect sense. As we learn new things, get more data, we should be open to adapting. And you touched on this a little bit, I think, in your answer just now, Dr. Speights, but we've got one about periods of how contagious you are. So how long are you potentially contagious once you've been exposed to the virus? And also, how long are you contagious once you have tested positive and been diagnosed with COVID-19?
Okay, so let's talk about that. Hopefully I'll hit both of those with one answer. The answer is it depends. So when you test positive for the virus, there's no way to really know how long you've been infected at that point. We know that most people shed the virus for several days before they have symptoms, and that's actually a big problem. As a matter of fact, about 24% of individuals are asymptomatic, meaning they don't have any symptoms, but they can still shed the virus and spread it to somebody. Another 30% or so are what we call pre-symptomatic, which means they have the virus, they're shedding it for several days before they ever have a fever, a cough, or muscle aches or headache. That's hard. The reason why that's hard is because you've got now this group of almost 50% or right at 50% who don't know they're sick, and they're spreading it to a vulnerable population who may have a bad outcome. And so that's an issue. The other thing that people don't recognize is the virus actually moves. And what I mean by that is it typically infects through the nose and the mouth. And that's typically the way you bring it in. You can get it through the eyes, though that's rare. It's not common, but it can actually come in through the eyes. And that would be you touching something and then rubbing your eyes or something like that. But typically it's the mouth and the nose. It moves. Once it gets to the back of your nose, back of your throat, it actually migrates down into the lungs. Why that's important is because if it's already moved, when you test and do that nasal swab, you may test negative. And so but you still may be positive for the virus because the virus has moved down the back of your throat and into your lungs. We've actually had that happen in the hospital. So in the hospital setting, we've had individuals who were like classic COVID. We test them, they're negative. You test them, they're negative. You test them, they're negative. And then they do worse. They end up on the ventilator. Only then can we pull fluid out of their lungs. We go test it and find out they are positive. So that's been something that's been frustrating for everybody as well, is to say, well, I can't get a blood test. No, we don't have a good blood test. Really, the nasal swab and the rapids, those are really the best thing we have right now. So in terms of how long are you infectious, that's where the 10 days isolation comes in. We feel pretty good that for the most part, once you test positive, you're probably not shedding that virus past 10 days. So once you're positive and once you've got the virus, once you hit the 10-day mark or so, probably before then, probably a couple of days before then, you're probably not shedding the virus. Is that an absolute for everybody? No, it's not. As a matter of fact, we do have case studies, and that's why it's kind of like when you talk about population health, you say, okay, for the most number of people, this is what we need to do because the majority of the people will fall into here, but not everybody will. Some people will shed the virus for 14 days. We have a case report of a lady who shed the virus for up to 70 days and could still be infectious, infecting other people. We just don't know. Now, you also have individuals who they get sick, they get over it, but they still test positive. What's that all about? Well, the test, remember, and depending on which test it is, largely is looking for pieces of the virus. And so that could still pick up pieces of the virus several days, several weeks after you were sick. That's why the CDC came out and said you really shouldn't be tested after or within a 90-day period after you test positive, because that's probably a false positive. Now, the only caveat to that is if you start having symptoms. So if I get COVID and mild COVID, I get over it, and then all of a sudden, a week and a half later, I get fever and headache and chills, they test me again, and I'm positive, right? More than a week and a half after I've gotten over it, I test positive again. That warrants more follow-up from your physician. So your doctor would need to look, because it is possible that you do still have it. And we've had cases of that. We've had cases, and it's in different populations, somebody with an autoimmune disorder or something like that, where an individual gets COVID. And the case in point that I'm talking about is actually a case study where they got COVID. It's a 47-year-old individual with an autoimmune disorder who got COVID, was hospitalized for 5 days, cleared the virus, got over it. Within about a week or so, started having symptoms again, was tested and tested positive. And the way they ran the test, they felt like, and that's a whole other conversation as well, it's called the CT count. But the CT count was high, and you think, okay, this probably is still the virus. He was readmitted 5 times in a 60-day period after that initial admission. Each time he tested positive for COVID, and each time they got actual virus from him. And what they figured out was, this is actually the virus fighting back on the human body. Now, because he was already immune suppressed, because he had an autoimmune disorder, basically his body would try to fight it, and then the virus would fight him, and it was kind of this back and forth. And unfortunately, he ended up, about day 128, he ended up dying from it because the virus fought back so much and actually ended up taking his life. That's rare. It doesn't happen a lot, but it does happen. The other piece that I'll talk about, and I realize I'm going off on all kinds of things here, but hopefully I'm hitting lots of questions at once. The other thing that I'll tell you, and we've had this question as well, how do you have some young person that seems normal and healthy, how do they die? But I've got my 75-year-old, dad who does okay. He's got a runny nose and a headache, and that's it. He clears it. Why is there such a discrepancy? We're finding more and more about the genetic components of COVID-19 and how the human genetic components actually interact with the viral genetic components. And what I mean by that is they did a case study on this. Specifically over in the Netherlands, there were 2 brothers, a 27-year-old, a 32-year-old brother. And they both got COVID and had severe COVID. And everybody's kind of scratching their head saying, we usually don't have a 27-year-old, a 30-year-old. They usually don't do this bad with COVID. So why are they different? And actually, one of them ended up in the ICU. The other one ended up dying from it. And so that launched this research project into these 2 individuals as well as 2 others about the same age who had the same response. What they found is when they did the DNA study on these individuals, they found out that they actually had a defect in their genetic code. The brothers did. The 4 individuals they studied had a defect in their genetic code. It's not something you would know about. It's that they were previously healthy. They had no issues at all, were on no medications, and had no disease processes they were aware of. It only cropped up during the COVID-19 infection. So we believe that there are underlying genetic abnormalities that individuals may have in their DNA that you're just not aware of because you didn't run into COVID until now. And so then this specific genetic abnormality actually sits on the X chromosome. If you'll remember, way back into your ASU days, men have an X and a Y chromosome. Women have an X and an X chromosome. This specifically hits men worse because if it's on your X chromosome and you've only got a Y left, then you're kind of out of luck. Women have another X chromosome to pull from. So it's not likely that they would succumb to it because they can draw from the other X chromosome to make up that genetic defect. So that's just one example that we've had in the last several weeks in terms of now peeling back the layers and saying, this is why someone appearingly young and healthy can actually succumb to it while someone older seems okay. There's more human genetics involved than we realize.
That's fascinating. So you talked about this a little bit, but we've got another question here about being an active carrier. So for example, we actually had a couple of questions about this. If I previously had COVID-19, let's say I tested positive in October, for example, and I'm exposed to the virus today, is it possible for me to still be a carrier and be infectious to others around me?
It's possible, it's not likely. And so
Okay.
let's go back to your story, your example there. Let's say you were positive back in October. Now, just bear with me, because the first thing I'm gonna say is, what kind of test did you have? Was it an antigen test? Was it a PCR test? Was it what kind of test was it? If it was a PCR test, what was the cycle threshold, or what was the CT count? This is important to know. You probably aren't hearing about this in the news, but it's important. The CT count means, and back up, a PCR test, that's our gold standard now. But you need to know, we don't usually use PCR tests for in this kind of mass way. We usually use them in research labs, and typically it's the test is taken and immediately goes to the lab and it's utilized. You don't put them in somebody's car and drive them down a Little Rock where things can degrade, and all of a sudden, somebody's driving through McDonald's and 5 hours later they show up at the lab. You don't usually have that happen with a PCR test. We're doing that now all over the country because it's the best thing that we have, the best thing we can use. And the antigen tests have helped, certainly on the symptomatic side. But PCR tests, when you run them, there's something called a cycle threshold. And what it means is when it runs through, it looks for pieces of the virus. It looks for genetic pieces of the virus. It runs through once, and I don't find anything, 2, 3, 4, I don't find anything, I don't find anything. And then all of a sudden, if it pops positive about 12 or 15, it's like, oh, okay, 12 or 15, now I've seen it a virus, that makes it positive. That's a pretty substantial or positive. I feel really good about that positive. If I have to run that thing 40 times, 45, 46 times, and now it pops positive, it's more likely to be a false negative or a false positive. And so that's something that the companies are now struggling with. And that we are, as physicians and researchers, going back and saying, hey, these tests run back in August, September, October. What was the CT count you guys were sending us positives back on? And so we're investigating that now, because early on, the CT counts were high because you didn't want to miss anybody. So if there's any chance at all that you had this virus, and just bear with me on this, from a public health standpoint, you'd much rather have them isolate and have them isolate and not be sick than say, no, you're fine, and they go out and they infect grandma and Uncle Joe and whoever drives the bus and everybody else, because those individuals can die from it or end up on the ventilator. So they were erring on the side of safety. As we've gotten better, those CT counts have come down. And so the question on, can I still be infectious? It really depends on pieces like that. In general, if you say back in October, I was positive and now I come in contact with somebody now, generally speaking, I think those individuals are not, if it's within 90 days, then you do not self-quarantine. So the 90 days seems to be the sweet spot for the CDC right now. So if you were positive, the middle of October, you're good for 90 days, even if you tested positive, as long as you don't have any symptoms. And this is the other question people have. Can I get COVID more than once? You can, but it's not likely. Now, let me back up. It's not likely right now. And let me give you the history on that. Here in the US, we largely have the European strain of COVID. As this all started, it started over in Asia, started over in China, blah, blah, blah. We expected to start seeing a bunch of cases come over from China and hit us in California. That seems natural. That's geographically closer. They're going to fly over. And we saw a few cases like that. But then all of a sudden it blew up in New York. And we're like, what's that all about? What happened was China, the strain of COVID over in China mutated. And it mutated when it moved across and hit Europe. And it got into Europe and hit Italy, Germany, the UK, France, Spain, all those areas, and it mutated. Became the European strain. And then, because there's so much travel back and forth there between the New York area and Europe, that's how it segued over. And there's actually a great website. It's a public website you can go to. It's called Next Strain. That's all one word, nextstrain.org. You can actually follow the genetics of the COVID-19 virus, because what happens is whenever somebody finds it, whenever we find it in a certain area, then what you do is you look at the genetic code and you see if it's changed any. And then we upload it to this open source website. It's called NextStrain, nextstrain.org. And so you can actually see, you can follow where it moved from China over into Europe and then came over here to the US. So you can follow how it got here. Well, that was the European strain. It's actually genetically different than the Chinese strain. And so we've had cases of individuals here in the US who were initially infected with the European strain, now get infected with the Chinese strain. I'll give you two examples. There was an example of an individual. This is the first one's a foreign example. Let me give you that one. Individual from South Korea who had gotten infected with the Chinese strain initially, went to Europe on a trip. As he was coming back through customs, they do routine testing there. He tested positive for the European strain. He had no symptoms. So he wasn't that sick, didn't even know he had it. So that's the first case of an individual truly getting sick with COVID twice that we knew from a hands down. We can classify the genetics of the virus. You got it twice. Then we had it happen here in Nevada or Arizona. I always get them confused. They're so close together. So we had an individual there who was positive for obviously the European strain here in the US. And then I think through travel, or got positive, or through connections through travel, was positive for the Chinese strain. Now he got sicker. So he was sicker with the Chinese strain versus the European strain. Don't read anything into that. I think it has to do with your own genetics and your own immune system in terms of how you respond to it. Don't make the assumption that the Chinese strain is worse than the European strain or anything like that. If you had to try to compare apples to apples, the European strain actually seems to be more infectious than the Chinese strain. So I think that's important. And we've also seen a case, I think, over in Atlanta. No surprise again, anywhere you're going to have like international travel, but we've not had a lot of that. So while it's possible, it's not likely. We might see some of it at the end of the spring of 2021 or into the summer of 2021. However, and we don't have the test results on this, we're hopeful the vaccine will actually cover both. If not, you'll see another vaccine come out, which I know people have that question too. Is it going to be seasonal? It's too soon to tell. The guess is that it may be initially if you see changes, because there's different things about the coronavirus and the family itself. Remember, the COVID-19 coronavirus is in the same family as MERS, same family as SARS. It's in the same family as the coronavirus that causes the common cold. Well, we don't have a vaccine for the common cold yet. We don't really have good treatments for the common cold. So you can see that kind of puts us at a disadvantage because this pandemic happened with the coronavirus. We originally, by the way, from a pandemic planning standpoint, we were planning for an influenza pandemic. And we did that back when this was discussions we had back with H1N1. We fully expected, actually an H5 is what we expected to see, was the avian influenza, was what we expected the pandemic to be. So I think people talked about it, and now of course people go, oh yeah, I thought it'd be the COVID. I mean, I didn't hear much about that. I always heard about the avian influenza being the pandemic, but that's probably more than you wanted to hear. Sorry.
Not at all. No, I appreciate the detail that we're able to go into there. We've got a question in the chat about vaccines. Do you see any concern with the COVID-19 vaccine being given to a person who has already recovered from the virus?
Oh, no, I don't. I don't see a problem with that at all. And let me go ahead and jump into vaccines, because that's a hot topic as well.
Yeah.
So there's 4 different platforms that these vaccines are being created on. And I actually, because I get a lot of these, I actually put some of this on a Facebook page. And I don't do Facebook. And thank you, Dr. Damphus, for introducing me to the caveats and to how to manage Facebook. I'm still learning. But I have put some of this stuff on a Facebook page to try to clear it up. But basically, there's 4 different platforms. And the first platform is the mRNA vaccine. Let me tell you about this. We knew these were going to come out first because producing this type of vaccine with this technology is actually faster. And that's where, Pfizer and Mrna come in. They were working on these mRNA vaccines. We knew they'd be the first ones to be rolled out, just based on the technology. We've not used this technology to mass produce a vaccine before. And so I think that's important. However, this is something we've been studying since the 1950s, and there was a lot of study and a lot of work done on the 1990s. So it's not like we just created this like last year. There's a ton of studies and a ton of information on this type of vaccine. And so really these trials that came out were really crucial in terms of the efficacy. And so now they've come out 94, 95% efficacy. I think that's great, with minimal side effects. And I can talk about the side effects too. So we feel good about the vaccine. You're not going to see a lot of it soon. And what I mean by that is the general public probably won't have access to a vaccine until late spring, early summer. I know what you're hearing in the news. I'm just telling you, I'm on the phone calls. I was on one earlier this morning. The state of Arkansas, for example, I think is going to end up with about 24,000 doses. You need to know that both of these initial vaccines are 2 doses, and one of them is 21 days apart. The other one's 28 days apart. The Pfizer vaccine, and the Mrna vaccine, they each kind of have their pros and cons in terms of storage. Logistics is going to be an issue. There is a hierarchy in terms of who gets it first. Obviously, frontline healthcare workers, frontline infrastructure, police, fire, EMS, those individuals get it first. Teachers, professors, those individuals are, I think they're 2A or 2B is there's a triage level, a tiered setup there. And actually the Arkansas Department of Health has this on their website. You can actually go download it and look at the tiered system that they put together. We don't expect really to have much vaccine at all until probably into January. It's when we'll start seeing it here, and it'll be a slow rollout until everybody kind of gets used to how to manage it. But I think the vaccine is going to be huge in terms of really curbing the tide of what we're seeing. I think it's going to be a little too late, unfortunately, for what we're running into in the next 4 to 6 weeks. After the Thanksgiving holiday, I think we're going to continue to see hospitalizations go up, unfortunately. And I think we're going to be into some dark times, so to speak. And I'm not the only one saying that you've heard that nationally, certainly in December and probably into January. But we'll just have to wait and see on that. What else on the vaccine? The other platforms that are coming out, those are more traditional platforms that we use, like for the hepatitis A vaccine, or even the influenza vaccine. Those are coming out later. You won't hear about those until the spring, just because of how long it actually takes to manufacture the vaccine using those platforms. One of them's protein-based, one of them's viral vector-based, and the other one's an attenuated style, which we've used forever and ever. And we've got a great safety profile on most of those. On the side effect piece, I know what I was going to say. Side effect, you'll hear about side effects with this vaccine, and it'll be like, it was tough for 24 hours or something like that. Just a word on vaccines, because I've had even my own patients, they don't do it anymore because we've gotten past it. I don't take the flu vaccine because it gives me the flu. It doesn't give you the flu. It's either an attenuated or a killed virus. It doesn't do that. What you're feeling is your body's response. What you're feeling is what you should feel. Whenever we inject something into your arm like that is foreign, we want your body to get mad at it. We want your body to create this inflammatory process and say, what is that? I don't know what it is. I want to create memory cells. I want to create, fighter cells. So if I ever see this again, then I can just knock it out. That's what you want to have happen. But that's what results in fatigue, a little bit of fever, achy, I don't feel good. Typically, it doesn't last any longer than 36 hours or so. Rarely can go past that. And here's the caveat too, and this is true for all vaccines, kids or adults, don't take Tylenol or ibuprofen before, don't take Tylenol or ibuprofen after. The studies are good that show that actually blunts your response to the vaccine. It can actually interfere with your body's immune system in terms of creating that memory cell, make the vaccine less effective.
Great information to know about the vaccines and the side effects there. Thank you for sharing that. We've got another question in the chat that I think will be helpful for a lot of people to hear about. So the question is an example. My parents are both in their 70s and they recently both had COVID, mild to moderate symptoms. They're continuing to have mild ongoing issues, but because they have now had COVID and are out of isolation, would it be relatively safe to see them over the holidays? And what precautions should we take under those circumstances?
So I'll draw you back to the one study I mentioned before where we don't really know how long. I mean, again, from a population standpoint, most people don't shed it past about 10 days. That's why we use that 10-day isolation period. And that's why we say if you still have symptoms at 10 days, you have to continue to isolate beyond that. It's because you're probably still shedding some. So really 10 to 12 days or so, most people won't shed it. But it's not that it can't happen. It's not that they can't, and that kind of goes back to the case study I said where we had an older lady who shed it for 70 days. That's not common, but it is possible. And so you'd want to take precautions for sure. But you bring up a really good piece in terms of they still have symptoms. That's a whole nother area, and we're just now scratching the surface of that in terms of what happens after COVID. What happens to an individual, do you just get over it and that's it? That doesn't seem to be the case. We've got 4 different categories that individuals seem to fall into, and we call it the post-COVID state. They call it the long haulers or long COVID. You may have read something about that. And what happens there is you have one group, and by the way, we don't have the percentages of who falls into what. That's still being studied. But you have one group who basically gets a mild infection, gets over it. I'm fine. I couldn't even tell it really bothered me. I'm back to work. I'm okay. You've got a second group who has what they call a roller coaster effect, where they're fine, but then about every 2 weeks or so, or every couple of weeks, they have this flare up and they feel bad again. And they're back in bed and they're just kind of, it's like there's a flare up. And a couple of things are going on there. Either it's still the virus, and like I talked about the autoimmune guy, that's less likely. It's more likely an autoimmune response. Basically, your body sees a piece of the virus that's still there because you can still shed it for a while, and it gets ramped up again, gets irritated, and you feel bad because of that. And that can cycle for quite a while. So that every 2-week flare up, I've read in the literature that there's been some people correlate that with like a rheumatoid arthritis attack. I hope that's not true because that's a whole different pathway, but it just seems to be a flare up. The third group has actually end organ damage. And this is important for people to know, and this is something I think the general public doesn't understand. Influenza, the flu virus, it goes into through your nose and your mouth, much like COVID. It goes down into your lungs and it wreaks havoc in the lungs, tears up the lung lining, and just causes all kinds of issues. But it doesn't really go past the lungs. It can move into and actually kind of affect the brain, but by and large, it doesn't do that. COVID, unfortunately, as it comes in and gets into your lungs, it likes to get into your bloodstream. And it specifically targets multiple different organ systems. And the organ systems that COVID targets, it targets the heart, obviously the lungs, it targets the brain, it targets the liver, it targets the kidneys, it targets the small bowel, the male genitalia, and the placenta of the pregnant female. And it also does something called thrombogenesis, which means that it creates blood clots, both arterial and venous. Why is that important? Well, this is where, if you've heard in the news and you've heard this debate back and forth, well, the guy came with a heart attack and they said it was COVID. Well, it could have been, because it could have been that the COVID virus that came in, maybe he had mild respiratory symptoms, but once it entered his bloodstream, it attacked his heart. We do have evidence of that. We know that happens. And that could cause his heart attack, or it could cause his stroke. It could cause his kidney failure. It can cross. We do have evidence of it crossing the placenta and infecting the baby. We don't have any bad effects right now that we're seeing from babies born with COVID, but we do know that happens. There were some UK studies that came out that showed that. So this is a different virus in terms of how it presents. So I think that's important for people to know, because you can have that third category that I was talking about. You can have end organ damage. Somebody gets over COVID, but their heart function is still low. And I've actually got a case of that. One of our colleagues in New York, she was a marathon and a triathlete, marathon runner and a triathlete. She struggles now after COVID to run 3 to 5 miles. She can get up to about 5 miles, and she got it back in April or May is when she got infected. And she was down in the bed, and she's, again, a marathon runner, triathlete. Now, why did it hit her so hard? And we have individuals, like you said, they're 60s and 70s, who get it, but they get over it. Again, there's probably some genetics there, but that third category, those individuals have end organ damage. We think most of it reverses, but we don't know yet. It's still too soon to tell. The fourth group are individuals who continue to have symptoms that just hang on for weeks and months. And it's just that they never quite get back to where they were before COVID. And so those are kind of the 4 categories right now of what we call long COVID or long haulers. But again, we are really just scratching the surface on the research. This is something you're going to read more about in the next, several, 18 months to 2 years or so. We'll get more data as we look back and look at these individuals. But I mean, we know now, we've done studies on young athletes who got COVID, who seem to have no symptoms at all, but you scan their chest and you can see damage to the lungs, you can see damage to the heart, even though they feel okay. So those are things that are obviously concerning as we look at the long term.
Absolutely. Well, we've got about 5 minutes left here, Dr. Speights, and I want to try to squeeze 2 quick questions into there if we can.
All right, I'll be short. I'm sorry, I won't be so long-winded.
Not at all. No, I love that you're able to just go into this detail like that. That's fantastic. The first question that I want to run by you here is still about COVID-19. There's stories we hear all the time about in a household, one person will test positive. The 3 to 4 others in that household can test negative, and that's puzzling to a lot of people with how infectious this virus is. Can you share a little bit of insight into that?
So the CDC actually came out talking about this back in the spring, and then I was kind of scratching my head over it too. I was like, well, wait a minute, if it's this infectious, how's the CDC putting out guidance in terms of having an infected individual in your household? And they talked about using a separate bathroom, sleep in separate rooms, using separate utensils, wear a mask while you're in the household. And so we have actually had cases of that. We've had cases where an individual who's positive in the house If everybody else stays kind of, not quarantined, but stays away from them, and they, you do good hand sanitizing, things like that, it is possible for somebody in your house to have COVID. And if everybody else does the right thing, then those individuals in the house don't get it. It's also possible that, especially if there's young kids in the house, the kids get it and don't know it. Young kids, really under the age of 10, really under the age of 10, there's this group 13 to 16 is kind of iffy. Under the age of 10, those little rascals get it and clear it rapidly. Like all the pediatric data from the very beginning, I remember seeing a research article and it showed the viral load of them. And like the kid data kept coming out, and there's all this small viral load. I was like, what is that all about? I mean, it's great because we don't have kids dying from it, obviously, or extremely rare that it happens. But they get it, and then they form a response, and they get rid of it quickly. The other group who doesn't get it, it's the extremes of age, by the way. Your 90-year-olds, your 95-year-olds, you read about the 102-year-old who had COVID and got it or got over it. That's the other group that seems to do really well. And the reason why is based on the immune system. So in the little kids, they especially the really young ones, their immune system's not ramped up and ready for it. In the old ones, their immune system's so, well, not old, but it's kind of tired. And so it doesn't really mount a big response either. Because some of the dysfunction that you see happen is because our own body gets ramped up. And that's why really the only drug out there that has shown a benefit in mortality for patients that are hospitalized in the ICU or on the ventilator with COVID is dexamethasone, which is Decadron. That's a steroid drug. I've used that drug for years and years and years. Got a great safety profile. It's cheap. It's generic. It's like 23 cents a vial. I mean, really, like it's a great drug. That is the only drug showing a mortality benefit now. And we only use it, by the way, because I want this caveat. Don't go ask your doctor for Decadron. That's not the way it works. You use it in the ICU or the hospital because at that point, when you get to that point, your body is really getting in your way. So your body is causing more damage to your cells than the virus really is. And so that's when you use them. You don't use it outpatient, or actually it gets in the way of your body doing its job. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Makes perfect sense. The last question that I want to run by you, Dr. Speights, is about finding good information out there. And you touched on this a little bit at the beginning. Even amongst physicians and doctors, data is evolving very quickly with this. Opinions are changing very quickly. As members of the general public, what are some things that we can look for to make sure that as we're trying to learn about this in real time, that we're finding good information?
So that was a frustration early on. You got to know, for most of us, you didn't, it was one of those things. And I had this conversation with someone back in the spring. As a doctor, I'm used to patients coming in, and I say, okay, yeah, you need this surgery, you need this medicine, whatever. They're like, and we explain it, we talk about it, and like, okay, doc, sounds good. And then they go on, and they'll go to have surgery. They'll take the medicine I give them. And, whatever. I'm the doctor. I'm prescribing it. And they're good with it. Now, again, it's more than that. I'm trying to go through a lot of explanation as to why I think this is the right thing to do. But we get pushed back on wearing a mask, and it's like, no, mask is a good thing. I don't know about that, doc. And it's like, seriously, like I just sent you for bypass surgery, and you're giving me a hard time over a mask. I mean, so it's. And what happens is then people in the field have come out and said, well, maybe masks aren't the right thing to do. I haven't seen a randomized controlled trial on that, which is that's the age-old answer for anybody in academia. Well, I need to see a randomized controlled trial on that. There's more to it than that for sure. So my answer would be to look at what society or institutional guidelines say. This is where you really have, because you're going to have a Yale professor who says this and a Harvard professor that says this. And you're going to have somebody from Columbia that says this, and then somebody from Stanford who says just the opposite. You're going to have that even within our own profession. And so that's why you've got to look at, like, what does the CDC say? What does the Institute of Health say? What does the NIH say? What does, these really like the Mayo Clinic, I mean, these larger groups, the American Academy of Family Physicians, the Infectious Disease Society of America, these larger groups who have to come up with a consensus. And so that way, this is going to sound bad. That way the crazies don't, you can't, because you're going to always have people on either ends of the spectrum. And so typically that's what you'll see me quote is I'll be quoting the CDC, the National Institute of Health, or I'll quote an actual article. So that way the individual can say, look, in JAMA or in the New England Journal of Medicine, they say this, and you can go and you can read it for yourself. But I try to put people or send people in the direction of an agency, an organization, or a society that has a bunch of people around the table before they come up with a recommendation. So that would be my advice, and that's really what I lean on. I read everybody's stuff, and I read both sides, and sometimes that just gets even more confusing.
Absolutely. All righty. Well, Dr. Speights, I cannot thank you enough for sharing your time with us today. I've certainly learned a lot, both about your institution here in Jonesboro and some health precautions that we can all take around COVID-19. So thanks again for spending some time with us today. We certainly appreciate it.
Happy to do it, Taylor. Thank you so much for having me.
Yes, sir. And before we end this, I do want to put a little bit of a selfless plug for these Lunch and Learn events out there. As I mentioned, this is the first in a series that we are kicking off at the Alumni Association. We have another one scheduled here coming up in 2 weeks on December 16th, excuse me. We will have Walmart's Senior Director of Global Emergency Management, Andrea Davis, here on December 16th, same time from noon to 1. And in January, in the new year, we will have Arkansas State's own Dr. Philip Tu talking about financial literacy. Dr. Tu runs Arkansas State University's flagship financial literacy program that we call Scarlet to Black. It's a program that we're very proud of. All of our students go through it. So please keep an eye out for information on those, and you can learn a little bit more about them on the A-State Alumni website, astatealumni.org. Look for information in the events tab there. I would encourage everybody here, please keep track of what we have going on, both Arkansas State and NYIT College of Osteopathic Medicine on Facebook and other social things. We are all over the place sharing information as best as we can. Thank you all for joining us today. And again, Dr. Speights, thank you so much.